Welcome everyone to this special bonus episode of the Antinatalist Advocacy Podcast, where we speak to interesting and knowledgeable people about how best to protect sentient beings from the harms of coming into existence. I am your host John, an antinatalist advocate from the UK, and I'll be the main host of the podcast going forward. So I can already hear you thinking, what is this whole bonus episode malarkey? Well, dear listener, let me explain. Lawrence and I were putting our heads together on plans for the podcast going forward and the different guests, topics and formats that we'd like to include. We noticed that there's a lot of content that has been or will be recorded elsewhere that ties into the themes that we cover on the Antinatalist Advocacy Podcast, and we therefore thought it would be a good idea to share the content on this platform, but also to make it clear that this wasn't originally recorded as an episode. We've got quite a lot of this type of content in the pipeline with our conference coming up in December and all the different talks and panels from that conference. So please do share your thoughts on this format and how best to present this type of content going forward. Speaking about the podcast, we feel like we've got into our groove with the monthly uploads, so we're going to be ambitious and release 2 episodes a month from here on out. The first will be on the 15th and the second will be on the final day of the month, whether that's the 30th, 31st, 28th, whatever. So please do keep your eyes peeled for those second episodes. Today we're going to be playing you the audio of a conversation I had on Lawrence's YouTube channel, which is obviously Lawrence Anton. This was last year and it was called How Antinatalists Can Do the Most Good. In the video, we chat about what we believe are the 4 cause areas of antinatalist activism, namely human procreation, animal agriculture, wild animal suffering, and digital sentience, as well as what antinatalists can learn from the Effective Altruism community about having a positive impact on the world. You'll also hear a little bit about how I became an antinatalist, which I'll talk a bit more about in a future episode. To make it clear that our bonus episodes are slightly different from our normal episodes, we've got a new thumbnail for the YouTube videos, as well as different intro music. It's quite poppy and upbeat, which might jar with some of the serious topics we cover on the show, but as we've said before, we want to help foster a positive antinatalist community, and hopefully this slightly cheesy music will contribute to that. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Anyway, without further ado, I bring you this bonus episode of the Antinatalist Advocacy Podcast with Lawrence and myself. Enjoy.
Welcome back to another conversation. So today I've got with me John, and we're going to be talking about effective altruism, and we'll get into what that is for anyone that doesn't know, but we'll be talking about effective altruism and it's sort of, I don't know how you'd put it, like confluence with antinatalism. If there is a confluence, if there is one, like, you know, what would the character of that be? And yeah, that's what we're going to get into. So before we get into the actual sort of like bulk of it, do you, John, just want to go into like a bit about yourself and like how did you come to be vegan and antinatalist?
Yep, sounds good. Thanks for having me on. Anyone who's watching this, apologies for the terrible light situation. Lawrence and I have just spent a good 5 minutes fucking around trying to get the... I can swear on here, right? I mean,
yeah.
That's... So yeah, how did I become vegan? So I was at uni, and like quite a lot of uni students, you end up talking about politics with not a huge amount of knowledge of what you're talking about. I grew up in a broadly left-wing family. Obviously, you go to uni, which is like a very left-wing space, and everyone's talking about politics and this kind of thing. In my 3rd year, I took a module in environmental law. I was studying law at uni, and again, as a left-wing student, you're obviously very passionate about the environment. And it was when I was studying this module that I saw how depressingly bad the situation was in terms of climate change and action on climate change. The way I describe it is that the problem would be up here somewhere. The law would be would be attempting to do this much, and how much was actually happening would be down here. So the law would be modest in trying to pass something that countries or corporations would agree to doing, which wouldn't address the whole problem, but would partly address the problem, but then even that law wouldn't be being upheld. So it was after seeing that I thought I do need to actually start doing something. I'd known for years that eating meat was bad for the environment since I was about 15, and we looked at it at school. And for the first time, I wasn't doing something for like social purposes. Like, we have to be honest, a lot of people talk about their political opinions to gain social acceptance. Like, they might in their heads think that, you know, they're doing a good thing, but really a lot of it's around social acceptance. But there was no pressure on anyone to go vegetarian or vegan at uni, despite everyone having a lot of lofty ideals. But I thought, no, this is something that I will actually do. I then Googled a video called, I just put into Google, like, why vegan, not vegetarian? Like, I didn't even understand it. I actually thought that by choosing to eat meat, I was actually helping animals, which is relevant for antinatalism, because I thought, well, if it wasn't for me, then they wouldn't live at all. So they have a good life, so I thought, and then a humane death, so I thought. And I'm actually doing them a favour, and that vegetarians are being squeamish and not helping animals by not giving them a good life. But yeah, after looking at slaughterhouse footage, looking at, in particular, the one that affected me was not all the violence that I saw, but it was actually a mother cow being separated from her calf in the dairy industry that really got me on an emotional level. And yeah, I decided to go vegan. So this was, sorry.
No, you go.
I was going to say, so this was back in 2015. I think in the years since, I had thought that I might not have children for environmental reasons, because again, I knew that in terms of like carbon stuff, having a kid would be a bad thing. I then became worried as a vegan that if I did choose to have children, then they wouldn't be vegan. I know this is a controversial opinion, but you know, children are raised by society. You can't brainwash your kids to do what you want them to do. And I was worried that I'd actually be creating more death and suffering by bringing non-vegans into the world. So I didn't realize at the time this was the misanthropic argument for antinatalism, but there was something that seemed off about me. And also, my girlfriend, who I'm still with now, had never wanted children. So while I hadn't really sat down and thought about it, I thought, okay, I probably won't have kids. And then Cosmic Skeptic on YouTube, who had recently gone vegan at the time, had an interview with David Benatar. And instantly, when I heard that his idea was that it was wrong to create sentient beings, I instantly had like negative opinions of him. I thought it was going to be an angry, bitter guy. It's so stupid, because I was a vegan, and before then I was a preachy lefty and also a keyboard atheist. And there's obviously a ton of negative like stereotypes about all of those groups, all of which I embodied, by the way, of being like preachy and angry. So I should have not been so judgmental. But then I listened to him and thought he's got a point. Then I listened to him debate Sam Harris, and I thought, you know, this guy's logic really stands up. I kind of explored the ideas of a few people, and I really did start to see the parallels between the arguments for going vegan and the arguments for going antinatalist. And then I think by the end of 2020, I'd say that, I'm very cautious of labels, because, as I was saying before, a lot of people pick a label for social purposes to get friends, and there's nothing really wrong with that. But I'd say by the end of 2020, I've been an antinatalist, and I think since the middle of since the beginning of last year, I started to talk about it a bit more openly.
So that's a bit about you, but the reason I've got you on is because of something that I guess is linked to both veganism and antinatalism, but we haven't actually talked about, which is effective altruism. So do you actually just want to go into just a basic guide of what effective altruism is to anyone who's like uninitiated watching this, and also like how did you first come across like effective altruism?
Sure. So, effective altruism, or EA, is a social movement that tries to do the most good possible using reason and evidence. I've worked in the charity sector on and off for about 8 years now, and a lot of the causes that people take up, as I was talking about before with me being left wing and this kind of thing, they're not chosen from. I'm still left wing, by the way, but I'd like to think I've
No,
thought
now
through
he's
it a bit
bigot.
more. Yeah, now I'm just, the shaven head, I'm just radically right wing, But yeah, a lot of the causes that people take up are mostly emotionally driven, and even the activism that people do for those causes is mostly emotionally driven. So EA's catchphrase is combining the head and the heart. So it's using the desire that a lot of us have to do good, and really trying to use reason and evidence to do the most good. And this started in the late noughties with like health interventions, and the basic argument being that you could give for the same, for millions of pounds that you give to, say, a cancer charity in the West, you could save people's lives from easily preventable deaths like malaria for a few £1,000s in a developing country. And if you really want to do the most good, your proximity to the suffering or the good that you can do really doesn't make any difference. Like, obviously living in the West, we all know people who have passed away from cancer. But it's quite rare for us to know someone who's passed away from malaria, but that doesn't really make a difference, at least it shouldn't ethically, that obviously this happens in different countries. And again, you can do so much more good for the money that you give to, say, cancer research. You can give it to a charity like the Against Malaria Foundation and do orders of magnitude more good in terms of saving human lives. So started with health and development. They have a big animal welfare component as well, which I think is fantastic and also obviously relevant for veganism. The site Animal Charity Evaluators evaluates charities by their impact and makes recommendations every year. I know that you use the site as well as I do.
Yeah.
And they also have an area of work which they are increasingly interested in, which is long-termism, which I think we'll get to later, which is around preserving and improving the long-run future of humanity, mostly all sentient life, but mostly humanity, which is of course very relevant for antinatalism. But in short, that's really it. It's around using reason and evidence to do the most good possible. And I think as far as it uses those kind of methods, I think it's a fantastic social movement for sure.
And before we go on to link it to antinatalism, if someone wanted to learn just about effective altruism generally, where would you point them as like a good intro? Would you say doing good better?
I think just Googling effective altruism main page would be good. So it's a movement rather than like one organization, if that makes sense. There's a bunch of affiliated organizations. 80,000 Hours is their career advice service. The reason it's called 80,000 Hours is because of the number of hours that you would approximately work throughout your career. It's how to use your career to do the most good. Give Well is phenomenal for charity donations, as we were talking about with like Animal Charity Evaluators. But I would start with just a Google search of effective altruism, see what's out there. It's all well like signposted and quite slick.
Cool. So I'll put links to all that sort of stuff in the description so anyone can find it. So bringing it on to the main topic of discussion, which is, so you've explained what effective altruism is. And so maybe some people are thinking, how is that related to antinatalism? And I'll just give my quick take on what I think is like the basic link between the two. And then if you want to like elaborate on it at all, go for it.
Sounds
but
good.
my like basic understanding of how they link together is basically that effective altruism, they, like you said, want to do the most good using reason and evidence, right? And they have let's say they have like a toolbox of tools they use to find out what's the most effective thing to do, and then practically doing it. But I think one sort of blind spot they have, or one tool that they don't have in their toolbox, is that just not creating new sentient beings is, I guess you wouldn't maybe call it altruistic, but it's preventing suffering that otherwise would occur. And obviously, effective altruism is essentially all about trying to alleviate suffering in the most effective way possible.
The
And what
one thing I will quickly add, sorry, about alleviating suffering is, while it's not an exclusively utilitarian organization in the sense of you have to be a utilitarian to get involved, the leading thinkers in effective altruism, Will MacAskill, Toby Ord, etc., Peter Singer, they are moral philosophers who are utilitarians and are motivated by reducing suffering and promoting well-being. Sorry, just to interject.
No, that's all good. And I think I don't know about like inside EA spaces, but at least the conversations I've had with people about EA, it all generally seems to fall along utilitarian lines anyway when you're having those conversations just naturally. So that's kind of how I see antinatalism and EA linking together. Is essentially EA are trying to do the most good with reason and evidence, and antinatalists are putting forward a new option for doing good, which is preventing, not creating new sentient beings to prevent the harm that would happen to them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just to add to that, we've both been a bit, I don't know if disappointed is the right term, but we're both concerned that, especially in vegan activism, but also antinatalist activism, that this approach of being very impact driven, impact focused, using reason and evidence to do the most good possible isn't really applied.
This was going to be my question. My next question was, so what are the positive things we can learn as antinatalists from effective altruism? And so I guess the first major thing you would say is be evidence driven rather than...
Absolutely, be impact driven. The animal welfare stuff that they do is fantastic, and it's also quite intuitive as well. You really don't need to be an expert to understand the approach that they take. They look at things like the largest number of animals, the intensity of suffering. So, for example, over 99% of animals killed by humans are in agriculture. A lot of vegan activism obviously focuses on things like circuses, leather, animal testing, this kind of thing. And as vegans, we both agree that we are against those things. We don't think it's good that the leather industry exists, but we can recognize that to be the most effective, that we should try to focus on the biggest problems and counteract the biggest problems. Again, in terms of the approaches that they recommend, donating money or even better, using your whole career to work on a problem is more effective than volunteering. There's things like the systemic change approach, like changing laws, changing practices. That is more effective than necessarily like an individual change approach. For vegan activism, again, a lot of vegan activism focuses on that individual change of trying to turn people vegan. So I think there's just so much there in terms of being impact driven and really following the data, which again, there's just so much there for vegans and antinatalists to use, including looking at areas which get overlooked, like wild animal suffering, which obviously ties in with antinatalism, at least non-speciesist antinatalism that considers all sentient beings and doesn't have an idyllic view of nature. Their work on wild animal suffering in terms of career paths, recognizing like rating charities that work in this field, promoting research into wild animal suffering, again, is really, really useful for antinatalists and vegans, for sure.
So just to put that in more like practical terms in terms of activism, I just want to give a couple of examples for people who may have done like antinatalist or vegan activism before. So essentially, what John was just saying in terms of the positive we can learn from effective altruism is essentially be like a lot of people in the like animal rights sphere engage in street outreach, which is individual change. And we're starting to see that emerge with antinatalism as well, with groups like I say groups. I think actually I can only think of one group that does it, which is Stop Having Kids. Yeah,
And
if there's
Danny
another
Shine,
one,
of course.
and Danny Shine,
Please
of course, as
do
well.
not procreate.
But we'll let Danny do his thing because it's fucking hilarious and really entertaining. So.
It is great entertainment for us. I love his videos.
So essentially, like, vegan activism has been really focused, at least like recently in the past decade, let's say, on street outreach, individual change.
Definitely.
And antinatalism is starting to get into that. And I think the thing that we can learn from effective altruism is going, well, let's hold up, like, sure, this is street outreach and individual change is the thing that we're used to doing, but actually, is it the most effective? That's what effective altruism is saying. They're basically saying, well, let's look at the evidence. Is it more effective to try get a high-paying job and donating like as much of that income as you can, instead of going out on the street and trying to change individual people to become vegan or to not have any children or another child? That's essentially the critique that effective altruism, or not critique, but the thing we can learn from effective altruism that's positive is to really think about how we do our activism and how we can best spend our time to help animals and also like prevent new beings from being created.
Yeah. I think a really key focus, sorry just to jump in again, but a really key concept is the idea of an opportunity cost, and how we have limited time and resources to affect positive change in the world. So what we decide to do is really important. And EA, Effective Altruism, says that it's not like we shouldn't focus on doing some good, which I get the feeling with a lot of vegan activism. There's almost a culture of not wanting to critique other forms of activism, and I do totally get that. Obviously, we don't want to be divided or whatever as a movement, but with the problems that there are in the world that veganism and antinatalism speaks to, we've only got so much time and resources to try and address these problems, and therefore we should, rather than say, okay, I'll go along to this protest and it will do some good in expectation, and say, no, how can I really do the most good, and how can I encourage others to do the most good as well? Because there is an opportunity cost to doing only a little bit of good that is potentially doing a lot more good with the time and resource that you spend on it.
And so that's like the positive lesson that EA has generated that we can learn from. But what negative things do you think we can learn from EA? And when I say that, I mean, have you seen EA trip up over any hurdles or do anything wrong that you think we as like antinatalists or vegans can look at and go, well, okay, we can learn from that and not make that same mistake?
So depends if we're going to get to long-termism a bit later or to address it now. I think
we'll do it next.
Okay, sounds good.
So leave that as the last one. Do the others you have first.
Great. So I think EA as a social movement is one of the best in terms of having likable people, as I say, being impact focused, and also disagreement as well. I think it's better than a lot of social movements in that regard. That said, it doesn't escape the cultish dynamics, the hero worship, and the sometimes arrogance and just general arseholery that you get in a lot of social movements as well. Like, it might have them a lot less, and there's a lot of public statements from the leading lights within EA to try and counter this. But I think any social movement that is attempting to do good and claims to be based upon reason and evidence, it can lead to social dynamics of people being sanctimonious arseholes, quite frankly. And we've all done it. We've done it as vegans, we've done it as antinatalists. When you hear the same dumb excuse for having children and you just dismiss it, it's just like, oh, don't need to hear that. But as a movement, it can really bite. And in EA, it has, a lot of people go to EA events and get put off by what they see as a lot of snobbery. And a lot of people have reasoned that because they are doing so much good, that they don't have to be nice, if that makes sense. And rationally, I get that totally, because if you're talking to me and I could go and talk to this person over here and have a more productive conversation, which in theory could lead to more reduction of suffering, I'm just going to say I'm not interested and turn around and walk off. Like, there's a rational case for doing that.
Yeah.
But if everyone does that, you turn from one arsehole into a huge snobbish, elitist
arseholes.
Exactly, yeah. And it's interesting we're having this conversation now. I know that we're scheduled to do this for a couple of weeks, but just over the weekend, FTX, which was the biggest funder of the biggest single funder, I believe, of EA funded work, has completely collapsed. It's a big crypto firm, and the guy who set it up expressly did so to earn to donate. So he'd sought to get the most money possible to earn to give, and it was phenomenal that he did that. Again, there's some questions around his dealings, and it did look like there's some fraud there, but you can recognize that if it is true that this is genuinely what he did, then this is a wonderful thing to do. But it did create, again, weird dynamics where people were scared to criticize him because he's the one that held all the power. Will McCaskill, who comes across as a very likable guy, the philosopher who set up EA, through no fault of his own, I think, because he's always trying to downplay and be humble. People do look to him a bit as a messiah. His latest book, What We Owe the Future, particularly with some of its optimistic long-term visualization. Some people might even say, what's it called when not paradise, when someone's a utopian, like with some potentially utopian visions. It does have some cultish, quasi-religious aspects. Again, I think that EA has them to a lesser extent than pretty much any other social movement that's trying to do good. Certainly compared to left-wing groups, environmental groups, vegan groups I've been in. But it can, the propensity for cultishness, hero worship, and elitism is unfortunately strong in EA, as it is in pretty much every social movement. So if the antinatalism can avoid that, if we can avoid hero worship, avoid being sanctimonious arseholes.
I think there's a fat chance, but we can try.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, human nature being as it is, it's probably going to happen. But I think we need to be wary of that. That a movement like EA that really has done its best to avoid these dynamics to some extent has still fallen prey to them, and that's something that we need to be wary of.
So you mentioned before long-termism when I was asking some, the negative things we could learn from EA, and we've mentioned it before, and it's the subject of Will McCaskill's new book, What We Owe the Future.
Yeah.
He's sort of essentially introducing it to the general public, basically. I think that is sort of like what he's trying to do. Is he's trying to make it more pop culture-y.
Yeah.
And I think you explained before briefly what long-termism is, but it's basically, I mean, the basic concept is that we need to have decision-making processes that take into account how we're going to impact the long term, but also recognize that we can make quite small actions now that will have massive benefits long term.
Yeah.
But also what is kind of linked in, and long-termism, one is quite heavily associated with effective altruism. They sort of coupled together. But also long-termism is kind of coupled with this enthusiasm to bring new generations into existence. I get the sort of impression that Will McCaskill every night sort of masturbates over the idea of just bringing new people into existence, just these billions and billions of people that we can give blissful lives to.
What were we just saying about not being sanctimonious and being ourselves? Wasn't very charitable there.
Look, it's early days. I'm still working on it.
That's fair.
So, but I'll try better. So we've spoken before, in just casual conversations, about how we kind of we understand where long-termism is coming from, but we don't like the fact that it's so enthusiastic. And I don't know if we came up with the term or we just sort of like threw some words together, but we kind of referred to the long-termism I think we would like to see is like reluctant long-termism.
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe go into what the difference is between enthusiastic and reluctant long-termism, and why you think reluctant long-termism is actually the more sensible route to go down?
Yeah, I think with any terms like long-termism, etc., they do tend to come with a lot of baggage, and the term long-termism hasn't been in use that long. That's partly one of the aims of Will McCaskill's book is to get the term out there. But as I understand it, its most stripped back version, I think, is a moral theory that's very plausible and one that we should uphold. And that is that sentient beings matter, no matter who they are in terms of the characteristics that they might have. If they're sentient, it doesn't matter if they are, the differences between people, black, white, rich, poor, countries that people come from, that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where they are either. Doesn't matter if they're in the UK like we are or in a different country. But it also doesn't matter, obviously, in terms of species as well as vegans. If someone's a sentient being, it doesn't matter if they're human or not. But also this idea says it doesn't matter when they are either. The idea being that if I do something now which hurts somebody in the future, let's say that I to use Will McCaskill's example, I drop a glass bottle and then I don't clear it up. And then through some weird future technology, I get a phone call in the future from someone 100 years down the line who says, "You arsehole, why did you not clear up that glass bottle? I've just cut my foot on it. I've just done some harm. It was wrong of me to drop that bottle because in all expectation, I knew that there was a very good chance they would cause some harm in the future. And it's not relevant that future being doesn't exist. So when we look at certain actions that we take today, like climate change, for example, we know that there's a decent chance that these actions will harm sentient beings in the future. And therefore, we should refrain from doing it. We should refrain from trashing the planet if it's going to harm those future beings. The reluctant and enthusiastic distinctions come in as they relate to the thing we were talking about with EA and this utopian vision of, our future technologically advanced Star Trek kind of universe where suffering has been engineered out of the experience of sentient beings, and it's just this glorious techno-utopia. Enthusiastic long-termists think that future people matter, and it would be a terrible shame if they don't come into existence, providing they don't live completely miserable lives. They think that it'll be a wonderful thing to do to have a really glorious long-run future. And reluctant long-termists like us, like antinatalists, think, yes, the beings that will inevitably come into the existence matter. The baby that will be born tomorrow in, I don't know, Argentina, who I'll never meet, they do matter morally. But it is a shame that these beings are being brought into existence. So we're reluctant in the sense of we recognize that those sentient beings matter, but it's a shame they're being brought into existence. And in that sense, it's really no different to the attitude that we have towards sentient beings that exist today. Like, I think you matter morally, Lawrence.
Cheers for that.
Just so you know, just in case you didn't know it. But I can say it was a shame that you were brought into existence, and you could say the same about me. Oh yeah, just another arsehole, just polluting the planet and all this stuff. No, I'm just kidding. But we can recognise that as antinatalists, it is a shame that sentient beings are created, but they still morally matter. And I don't think the time when they are brought into existence is relevant.
Yeah, like the way that I would put it most simply of the difference between enthusiastic and reluctant long-termism is basically that like both worldviews care about future sentient beings. It's just one wants to actively bring them into existence and the other one doesn't, but recognizes that some inevitably will. And I think it seems to me like antinatalism fits very well with reluctant long-termism. If anything, it's sort of antinatalism is the foundation to reluctant long-termism. So if that's a bit about like effective altruism, how antinatalism can link to it, the lessons that we can learn from EA in positive and negative ways, so things that we can aim towards we've learned and things that we can try to avoid. Talking about antinatalism as a sort of like antinatalism, how's it best to say this? So thinking about antinatalist activism, but using the EA framework, what topics and issues do you think that form of activism should care most about and requires the most attention? Obviously, like, we haven't done a study or any, like, we haven't compiled a report to know exactly what those topics are going to be. But off the top of your head, what do you think are the key topics that, like, antinatalist effective altruism should focus on?
Yeah, I think this is where my opinions differ from a lot of the antinatalists that I have encountered online, in thinking that human procreation shouldn't actually be top of the agenda when it comes to antinatalist activism. And the reason is twofold. The first being that humans make up a comparatively small proportion of sentient beings alive today. 7 billion human, well, about 8 billion now. I think we've just reached 8 billion.
Yeah, at least sometime this week we're going to reach 8 billion.
So 8 billion humans, but as a low estimate, in 1 year there will be 56 billion farmed animals, and that's a very low estimate. I've seen estimates 80, 100. I'll just pick the lowest one. And then when it comes to wild animals, the number of wild animals just dwarfs the size of the farmed animals. So in terms of the number of beings, humans are quite small. And secondly, the quality of human lives is, by certainly any metric that I've come across, considerably better than most, if not all, non-human animals. So I don't think that's controversial when it comes to farmed animals. I mean, they are literally factory farms are concentration camps for animals. It's horrific. But when it comes to wild animals, even within the antinatalist community, and you've got groups like Vehement that want humans to go extinct so that nature can flourish and we'll have thriving ecosystems again.
And just for anyone that doesn't know what Vehement is, it's voluntary human extinction movement.
Yeah. So the idea where human beings should go extinct because of our impact on the environment, and if humans weren't here, you would have perfectly balanced ecosystems with everyone living in harmony. The amount of suffering and death in nature is just extraordinary. So many animals are strategists when it comes to reproduction, which means that they'll have lots and lots of offspring, because not many of them will survive. So for a visual example, if you think of like a frog, they'll create lots and lots of tadpoles. And for a frog population or any animal population that isn't growing, the number of frogs that would survive to breed is 1. So if you think of those hundreds or thousands of tadpoles, just 1 reaches adulthood and the rest of them all die. So we have to acknowledge, again, the quality of life that humans have compared to non-human animals, as well as the number. I actually did think of a third reason, in fact, and that is that if humans were to die out, if Vehement did get their way, then there would be no beings left really capable of doing anything about the animal suffering that would be all around. There's a lot of misanthropy in the antinatalist and vegan communities, and I totally get it. Humans, we are moral agents and we still do really fucked up things to each other and to other sentient beings, but we are the only beings that we know of that are capable of ending suffering, of consciously deciding to stop procreating, of consciously causing other animals to peacefully go extinct by, for example, ending factory farming and not breeding them into existence. So yeah, for those three reasons, the quality of life, human life, the number of humans, and the fact that if humans do go extinct, it'll leave a whole bunch more suffering. I don't think we should focus on human procreation first.
So, can I, just before you move on from human procreation, I just want to kind of summarize that in slightly different words in case anyone, because I think like the vast majority of people who are going to watch this are going to be antinatalist, and to hear another antinatalist say we shouldn't focus on human procreation is going to be like, is potentially going to be very counterintuitive. And I actually think you did a really good job of like explaining why. But just for people to get it, I want to go back to the idea of opportunity costs that you talked about before. So most most antinatalists, if they were going to do activism like stop having kids, for example, it would be completely focused on human procreation.
Yeah.
And essentially what you're saying is that if we're talking about non-species antinatalism, we need to look at the totality of sentient beings in existence, which is trillions and trillions and trillions. Humans, and even the sentient beings we create, like in domesticated animals, like domesticated animals and humans put together are still a tiny percentage of the overall number of sentient beings who can suffer, which is the suffering they go through and we go through is the stuff that we're concerned about and we want to alleviate and try and prevent from happening in the first place. And so you have an opportunity cost when you focus your activism on human procreation. You fall foul of opportunity costs in the three ways that you spoke about. So one, you're putting your effort into a section of all potential beings or all beings that do exist that is very small. So you're aiming at a very narrow slice. That slice actually is like relatively well off. In obviously not every human is relatively well off. Like some humans will have completely shit lives, but generally speaking, humans as a category have relatively good lives compared to most sentient beings. And also, if we do focus on preventing humans from coming into existence, it'll mean that we could potentially hinder the capacity. We would also hinder the capacity for humans to do bad, but we would hinder the capacity for humans to do good for the vast majority of other like beings that are out there, right? So it's if we focus on human procreation, these are the opportunity costs we're going to fall foul of. And that is why the effective altruist framework points away from human procreation as to where we focus our efforts, because it's essentially like there are low-hanging fruits and human procreation isn't really one of them.
Yes.
It would
Absolutely.
be like, to give an analogy, if we want to focus on humans, it would be like as an antinatalist activist going into the richest part of the world and trying to convince rich people who have probably one or two kids and the kids have relatively good lives, trying to convince them to have no kids rather than go somewhere else where people are having loads of children and the children have shit lives, and going in there and trying to help those people to not have more kids by access to contraception and education, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm noticing a pattern here. Well, I will waffle on for a good few minutes and then you'll succinctly summarize what I was trying to say. So I definitely appreciate that.
Well, no, I mean, I waffled there as well. So
it's the blind leading the blind. Well, one thing I will say though is that, well, I don't think this should be the primary cause area of antinatalist activism. I do think it is important for the ideas of antinatalism to propagate. And the way you do that, I think, is by leading by example and making it clear that, again, we shouldn't be having children. In the same way that a vegan can say, right, I'm not going to wear leather and I'm not going to go to the circus, but that I'm not going to make that the cornerstone of my activism, if that makes sense, because there are other problems out there. You were talking about, like in your example, about how the procreation for people who are in worse scenarios. I do think actually that for the propagation of antinatalist ideas, it might be worth dedicating some time on that, in the sense of like women's empowerment initiatives in developing countries, access to contraception, that kind of thing. But I think the main good of that would probably be through the, if it's done well, the proliferation of antinatalist ideas compared to, say, if we moved away from factory farming, that kind of thing.
So that would be sort of giving some time to focusing on humans, but really not for the end of preventing. Well, that would be a benefit, preventing new humans from being created, but it's to the end that humans would increase their capacity for doing good for the vast majority of beings, right? Because there would be more people with the antinatalist meme in their head and wanting to do good.
Absolutely. And also, not having children frees up your capacity to do good in the world.
Yeah.
It saves you, well, inflation's probably a lot higher, but last time I looked, 200 grand a pop in the West. So you could be donating to charity. So even on a monetary thing, it's worth not having children. You mentioned the other, you asked about the cause areas. I do think that human procreation is something we should be, something we should care about, but not necessarily something we should focus on. Factory farming and wild animal suffering. It's hard to tell which one to focus on more, because with factory farming, like the intensity of suffering is obviously extremely intense, and it's also one which is quite tractable in terms of we can actually do something about it. So by encouraging people to switch towards plant-based food systems or lab-grown meat, you can save, we would save tens of billions of animals each year from being tortured and killed. On the other hand, wild animal suffering, there's a very, very large number of beings, and also it's a very neglected area. So one person could conceivably have a very big impact in wild animal suffering, especially given that all the trends at the moment in environmental activism are increasing wild animal suffering. So, for example, even in vegan communities, it's quite popular to advocate for rewilding, where you take an area of land which doesn't have wild animals there and you create one of these thriving ecosystems. Obviously, there's tons of conservation efforts which often focus on predators, so save the lions, save the tigers. Obviously, these beings go ahead to rip to shreds other sentient beings. So there's potentially a huge opportunity there for people to counter some of these trends for people in the environmentalist space who think they're helping wild animals, to actually say, no, focus on the experience of the individual animal rather than on things like species conservation, biodiversity, that kind of thing. Then the last area, this is where it gets a bit sci-fi, is in the realm of AI and the idea that we could conceivably create just untold amount of suffering, untold numbers of new sentient beings through AI. So at the moment, we don't have any reason to believe that AI, artificial intelligence, it's like computer systems. We could conceivably create computers that would be, or devices that would be sentient, experience pain, suffering, have a desire to live, all this kind of thing. And in theory, we could, if we were to do that, and this being was to kind of replicate itself quickly, we could create vast numbers of sentient beings, and also beings that have the capacity to suffer way more intensely than we do. They might have more emotional intelligence or more sensitivity to experience, in the same way as a pocket calculator can calculate maths hundreds of thousands of times faster than humans can. We might accidentally create computers or intentionally create computers that can experience experiences hundreds of thousands of times more intensely than people can. So hard to know of what specific examples to go through there, other than just try and prevent sentient AI being brought into existence, I say. But those are, just to recap, those four cause areas. So human procreation, animal agriculture, wild animal suffering, and artificial intelligence, I think, are the four cause areas that antinatalists should focus on. But very quickly, mate, I just need to go and blow my nose. It's kind of grim.
No, that's
helping with the creepy face with snot running. 1 second.
No, go for it. I can edit this bit out.
I think you should leave that bit in, because otherwise people might wonder what you. I'm always, if I'm watching a stream and it gets cut out, I think, what did someone go on a racist tirade, or they do a line of coke off the laptop. Like, what was that?
Yeah,
It was all very innocent. I
definitely
was
the
just
vibe we're giving off.
absolutely, yeah.
Um, cool. So I will leave that bit in then. Actually, so so we've gone over if antinatalism and effective altruism were to come together in a confluence, what the key areas we think, at least at this point, would be those four that you've just gone over. And it may be the case that there may actually be a fifth or sixth key area of focus. It's just that, I mean, can you think of anyone in the world that is doing research on antinatalist effective altruism? Like maybe there's like one or two people who are doing stuff related to it, but there's no one who's consciously sat down with those two ideas merged in their mind doing research on that. Can you think of anyone? Yeah.
I don't know anyone who would give themselves the label of an antinatalist effective altruist. There are people in the effective altruist space, like Brian Tomasic and Magnus Finding, who have certainly said antinatalist adjacent things. In your links, if you can link the forum post that Magnus Finding did, which was criticizing McCaskill's chapter in his new book about creating happy people, I think that would be brilliant. And there are organizations that are EA affiliated, the Center for Reducing Suffering, the Center for Suffering Risk, this kind of thing. But no one that has all the, the complete package, if you like. There's not like a David Benatar type philosopher who's EA affiliated. And one day, hopefully, there will be. But one thing I will say is there's just still so much out there for antinatalists. Their research on animal suffering, even some of their research on AI, to be fair, because people are concerned about this in the EA communities, like, can we create AI that suffers? The research on animal agriculture and interestingly, in their global health and development portfolio, women's rights charities, access to abortion, access to contraception, etc., on human procreation. So there's lots of evidence-backed initiatives that we can definitely get behind, even if it doesn't at the moment come under the banner of antinatalist effective altruism.
Yeah, and the reason I brought that up is because I was saying there's like the four areas that we've sort of pointed out, but because this specific way of looking at EA is not really a thing at the moment, and no one's been focused on doing research on this, there may be large cause areas that we just haven't really thought of yet.
Yeah, big moral
they might
spots.
just exactly. It might be a big like antinatalism is a big moral blind spot to EA. Generally speaking, antinatalist effective altruism may have a big moral blind spot that will be discovered when people start to spend more time thinking about this stuff. So the next thing I wanted to ask is, obviously, we haven't actually, I think we've actually already answered that question. So what do you think, if this sort of idea of linking antinatalism and effective altruism is put out into the antinatalist world, which if it hasn't before, it will be with this video, what do you think could be like expected kickback for introducing effective altruism into antinatalist sort of circles or thinking?
So, interestingly, when I've been talking about impact within animal rights spaces, a lot of people find that it can be quite a heartless way of looking at the world, in the sense of, if you're saying don't go to the fur demo, the anti-fur demo, you should stay at home and donate the money that you would have spent traveling to the fur demo to an effective charity that works on factory farming. People think there's something almost heartless about that. That you're saying, therefore, that you don't care about fur. And it's really not that you're saying that, but I can understand why people have that perspective, because you're saying that we shouldn't be campaigning on that issue. And I can see something similar with antinatalism, where if I'm coming along and saying, don't focus on human procreation, like humans have better lives than wild animal suffering or wild animals, people could see that as quite heartless, that I'd be in some way validating their experience of suffering. And also as well, a big reason that people choose the activism that they choose is for social reasons. Like, we have to be honest. Even now, both of us still occasionally go to vegan activism, which we don't even believe to be that impactful, for social reasons. I guess we do it more explicitly and more consciously than others do. But, you know, living in a natalist world when you're an antinatalist, or a non-vegan world when you're a vegan, can be very isolating, and it can be hard to know what to do. And if you find comfort going to your Stop Having Kids group, just for example, or an Anonymous for the Voiceless or whatever, and then
or going around with a megaphone,
or doing a Danny Shine. Danny could do it in the EA antinatalist future that we'd all like to live in. Danny Shine would still be there.
Yeah, he's one of the key cause areas.
Absolutely.
Is those four and megaphones.
And his role would be to keep the spirits up of antinatalism, producing such great content. If someone comes along and says the activism that you're doing, which you get so much from, is, even if you don't say it like this, they interpret it as a waste of time, then that can be quite hurtful. And again, for people who aren't used to engaging with data, who sometimes find this stuff intimidating, you can appear like that snob that comes along and says, well, the evidence doesn't back this, the study did this, and this kind of thing. So I think it's partly on those of us who would try and align antinatalism with some EA principles around maximizing impact, to make the message palatable and recognize some of the emotional attachment that people can have to the old way of doing things. Particularly with something like wild animal suffering, it's a comforting view to people, I think, to think that nature is wonderful. Nature is a world that doesn't have Jeffrey Dahmer, it doesn't have Vladimir Putin, it doesn't have factory farming, it doesn't have all of these moral atrocities, in the sense of the animals that cause suffering in the wild aren't agents. They're not actively going out to cause harm, because they don't make a moral decision to do it. Whereas if humans are around, that is the case. I can understand why a human-free world has its appeals. There is something comforting about that, and letting go of that comforting thing to face up to the reality of some of the things we're talking about can be very upsetting. And I don't think that should be dismissed either. We're talking about EA being a bit snobby. I think that sometimes EA can be a little too harsh on people for having perfectly understandable emotional reaction to something and saying, well, that's not rational. It's not rational, but I don't think you need to be an arsehole about it.
Yeah. And I think there will be negative kickback to trying to introduce EA sort of frameworks or ideas into antinatalist circles, but I think that's why it's actually important to do it earlier than later, because antinatalist activism is, I haven't been in antinatalist circles for an amazingly long time, but from what I know about what it was like before I was in them, it seems like the activism side of it is kind of just getting going. And I guess if there's potential for the activism to go down the route of being relatively ineffective, when it could go down a route of being much more effective, it's better to try and shift that trajectory much earlier on, which is actually something that Will MacAskill talks about in his new book, What We Owe the Future. I've just started reading it, I'm not that far into it, but he uses the example of like climate change. He says that the negative impact that humans could have on the environment generally, but specifically on the climate, has been known about since I believe the 1800s.
Yeah.
And if relatively small, low-cost things could have been done back then, we could be in a much better position than we are in now.
Absolutely.
And the same sort of idea of or way of thinking about it could be applied to antinatalist activism. Because I think if, like in vegan activism, at least maybe less so since the pandemic, but before the pandemic, there was massive amounts of people doing street outreach. It's maybe died off a bit since the pandemic, but it's starting to come back up. But that now is like the established form of animal rights activism.
Absolutely.
And if earlier on the trajectory of animal rights activism had gone more down the effective altruism route using that framework, the animal rights movement could have done a lot more than it has done to date so far. Not saying it hasn't done a lot, like the animal rights movement has come a long way, but using the EA model of things, it could have done a lot more in the time and energy that we've spent. And so, trying to address these things early on in antinatalist activism can help avoid like that opportunity cost.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, antinatalist activism is looking out to other social movements that have come beforehand, like animal rights, and they see the dominant modes of activism. They see it's protests, it's placards, it's billboards, it's individual change stuff. And the other stuff, like sitting at home donating or signing a petition. Sorry, mate.
No, it's all good.
Finish this one. That stuff is less visible. It's not what you see around you. So if you're trying to form a movement, it's easy to rally people around a literal rally than it is behind, I think, donate, click on this link and donate, But sorry,
yeah, and no, I was just going to say, I think it's definitely true of animal rights, because I think my perception has been, and it's not like I've done a study on this, but my perception has been that most people who are starting to do antinatalist activism are coming over from the animal rights movement, because I think generally they tend to be vegan activists who either are newly antinatalist or have been for a while and are pivoting into antinatalist activism. But with that backdrop of their animal rights experience.
I mean, that's how it is for me, and I think it's the same for you, isn't it?
Yeah. I've been vegan and antinatalist round about the same time, but I've been doing animal rights stuff for like 5 years, and I've only really just started doing antinatalist stuff in the past couple of years. So I definitely came from that perspective. So I asked about what you think could be kickback from introducing EA ideas into antinatalist circles, but what about the other way around? What if we put out this video and loads of antinatalists are like, this is a sick idea, let's start doing this, and we start to build some momentum, and then the wider EA community learns about this new sort of offshoot, or whatever you want to call it, of EA being a sort of antinatalist tinge to it. Do you think there could be any potential kickback from the wider EA movement? So one like example that I can think of straight away off the top of my head is the rest of EA seeing like the antinatalist form and going, well, that could be really fucking bad PR. So let's fucking ignore that or quelch that.
I think that is the pushback that people have had, and that I don't know if you're familiar with David Pearce, the philosopher, transhumanist philosopher. Speaks a lot about wild animal suffering and engineering suffering out of sentient existence. And one of the things he says is that we're just not going to be able to convince people that stopping creating sentient beings is a good thing. So we should try and engineer suffering out of the experience of sentient beings, because sentient beings are going to be created. And to some extent, I am very sympathetic towards that view. But then on the other hand, I think no one has really tried to propagate this. And similar criticisms could be made of every social movement before it's really gotten going, especially an evidence-backed one. Because again, EA was quite groundbreaking. It's amazing how young EA is. It's only since 2009 since it's really got going. And it's achieved a lot, but it's really quite shocking for somebody who works in the charity sector how groundbreaking that approach is to using reason and evidence to do the most good. So there hasn't been an evidence-backed, there hasn't been an antinatalist movement really, let alone an evidence-backed one. So I think before we give up and just say the natalists have won, let's give up on this antinatalist project, I think it might be worth giving it a good go, I think the philosophical objections will come back. I think in a similar way that a lot of vegans take comfort in the idea of a thriving ecosystem without people and how wonderful that is. I think there is genuinely something comforting about the idea of a techno-utopian, glorious human future where we don't have a Ukraine war, where we don't have climate change, where we don't have children dying of malaria. There is something motivating about that, and I think it gives people a place in the world. And all of us who get involved in a social movement, I think, need to be careful that we are genuinely trying to do the most good, not for those self-serving purposes I talked about earlier with me being a left-wing student. We have to be constantly guarded about that, because it's so easy to rationalize yourself into taking a position which you personally find comforting and convincing yourself that that's doing the most good. So striving for this techno-utopian future rather than working on the problems we face today can be more exciting, more comforting than the alternative. So I think there'll be that. And in terms of like philosophical objections, I was just going to say, sorry. Rather disappointingly, some people in the EA community have given antinatalism an unfair hearing. They haven't given it a fair hearing. I think another post there from Magnus Vinding about the dismal dismissal of suffering-focused ethics. We've got leading lights in the EA movement like Will MacAskill and Toby Ord calling suffering-focused views like lead towards negative antinatalism. Call them transparently silly. Will MacAskill has said that these kinds of views question the assumption that life is wonderful and a gift and therefore should be dismissed. I'm slightly paraphrasing there, but essentially that a view should be dismissed for questioning the premise of life being a good thing. Well, if antinatalism is a philosophy which questions the inherent goodness of sentient existence, then according to Will MacAskill, it should just be dismissed out of hand, And then others in the EA community just saying things like, antinatalism is about as sophisticated as keyboard atheism, and it's just this edgy counterculture thing, and just not addressing the serious philosophical concerns that someone like David Benatar would have. So that's a shame, a great shame. But as I said, I do think there is opportunity there because these views haven't been put forward in this evidence-backed and reasoned way before. So yeah, I think there's lots of potential for positive impacts.
Yeah, I got two things just off the back of that came into my mind. So if I forget the second one, remind me with David Benatar. Okay. So the first one is, I think one potential I don't know if drawback is the right word, but one potential obstacle with getting one potential obstacle with measuring the good that is done through an antinatalist lens, but also getting antinatalism and effective altruism as a merger to be more accepted generally by EA, is that I think the benefits that would be brought around by introducing antinatalism are not necessarily tangible, because the benefits come in not creating people, and it's hard to see because because what you're trying to do is essentially maintain non-existence rather than more sentient beings being created into it, it's hard to tell what the actual benefits have been.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which would maybe be one valid criticism of antinatalist EA, that may be one valid criticism that has to be like ironed out. What is an effective way of measuring the good that can be done through an antinatalist lens? So I think that may be one thing that maybe means that the antinatalist sort of flavor of EA is seen as less credible.
One thing I will say to push back is that the same could be said about this long-term future stuff.
That's true.
The long-term future will never arrive. We're only ever living in the present. And when in 10,000 years' time, if there are a bunch of people living in this techno universe, they won't think of themselves as living in the long-term future. The long-term future could be another 10,000 years or 10 million years, however long it is. So I'm not sure if that would necessarily be a criticism, just because the EA folks are currently involved in a lot of like speculative approaches compared to what they used to do, which was more tangible. We've delivered this many bed nets, we've changed this many laws, etc.
So that's a good point. So the other thing I was going to say, so
David
I've asked
Benatar.
about, so what I was going to ask about now is, do you think, how do you think, and it's completely fine if you don't have any thoughts on this, because well, you'll see why, but how do you think in academic circles antinatalism is, most of the sort of content that's being created, or the memes that have been created around antinatalism, have been from academic circles, right, with people like David Benatar. How do you and often people in academia are used to working in abstracts or working with ideas rather than the practical implementation of said ideas, right? And maybe one person who straddles those two things is Peter Singer. He very much works in the abstract, but also in the practical as well, with things like the life you can save. Yeah,
absolutely.
So how do you think this idea of mixing effective altruism in with antinatalism could be received by the academic side of things, by people like David Benatar? Do you think that would be something that they would maybe welcome, or they would be skeptical of?
Well, from David Benatar personally, I know that he has said that he's very cautious about people playing God and having utopian visions that they try to enact. And I do think that is true. If someone was to devote their whole life to creating the benevolent world exploder, for example, I'm not sure if that's something that even I would support. However, I do think, Benatar does encourage applied ethics. He encourages people to go vegan and not have children, for example. And I think that, from my understanding, like, philosophers are generally quite happy to see applied ethics, because one criticism of philosophy that we've all heard is that it's just a bunch of people arguing and nothing changes. A bunch of people arguing back and forth in these academic journals that no one reads, a bunch of old men stroking their beards, and no tangible good happens in the world. And Peter Singer was someone who always said, no, we need to do stuff about this and encourage people to do stuff about this. And it's no surprise that it was Peter Singer, as well as Will MacAskill and Toby Ord, who were moral philosophers who really wanted to create tangible change and apply ethics in the real world. Get it out of the seminar room, out of these, 50 pounds, as in pounds in terms of money, not in terms of like weight for any Americans. These kind of like £50, 800-word philosophy textbooks that, no one really reads outside of academia, and have some tangible impact in the world. I think potentially the academics would be quite glad to see people doing something, and particularly with antinatalism, where there aren't these, as far as I'm aware, and I'd be happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, there aren't these examples of people trying these utopian ideals which blow up in people's faces. I mean, I'm not sure if I want to see any more applications of Marxism, to be honest. I think the 20th century is. I'm not sure if it's worth one more heave to bring about socialism. I'm sorry, and my socialist family, if you ever see this, I'm sorry, but the tremendous piles of skulls in Cambodia and the former
Mm,
Soviet Union have put me off the practical application of those ideals. Whereas with antinatalism, again, in this evidence-backed way, I don't think we have that baggage of people trying
mm.
to enact those ideas and then blowing up in people's faces.
Yeah, no, that's true. And if we're speaking specifically about David Benatar, I think he actually has officially commented on effective altruism linked things, because he wrote Peter Singer wrote his famous Famine, Affluence, and Poverty, right?
Famine,
That
affluence,
was
and morality, yes. That
and
is the
morality.
essay which motivated Will MacAskill to start effective altruism. This idea that
Yeah.
there is this moral problem and we should do something about it.
Mm. And David Benatar wrote a critique of that called Famine, Affluence, and Procreation, I think.
Interesting.
So I'll link that in the description as well for anyone that wants to read that. And he was basically making the point that we're making, and he was saying, like, yeah, it's good what you're saying, Peter, as in Peter Singer, but one thing you're missing out is that actually non-procreation is a meaningful way that we can attain the things that you're saying that we should try and attain,
Absolutely. Yeah.
or strive for. So it would be really interesting as things progress, if they progress, to see what someone like Benatar's reaction would be,
Yeah.
because it's something he has commented on. So, and commented on making the same critique that I think we're basically making in this video.
And one thing I will say is that, the leading lights in those leading philosophical lights in EA, so Peter Singer, Toby Ord, and Will MacAskill, are all aware of Benatar. They've all replied to some of his work. Again, not in a way that I think is particularly convincing, but Benatar gets a mention in MacAskill's book, doesn't seek to try and counter his arguments, which is a bit of a shame, especially as he wrote a chapter on population ethics, it being a good idea to create happy people. But he is on the radar of some of the leading philosophical lights within EA, and I think that's a start. That's there's potentially some potential. Potentially some potential is a horrific sentence, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. But it also means that at least generally EA is aware that antinatalism exists as a thing,
Yes,
so it's not going to come
absolutely, yeah.
completely out of the blue.
Yeah.
So what if someone is listening to this and they're convinced by what we're saying, and they think, you know what, I actually think it's a good idea to use an EA sort of framework strategy applied to antinatalist activism, and I want to pursue this. What do you actually think tangibly an individual antinatalist watching this video can do now? We haven't, not all the research has been done on this specific thing, so we don't know exactly concretely what the most effective things are to do. But from your understanding at the moment, what advice would you give someone watching this video who is convinced? What would you advise their next steps to be?
So one thing I would say is that while we don't necessarily know what would be the best thing to do for, I'll call it the total antinatalist approach that addresses all four of the cause areas that we talked about using an antinatalist lens, there is still some promising work, like I was saying, for each of these different areas. So I think we should take advantage of all of the different resources that EAs have put out there about how to have impact on factory farming, on women's rights and reproductive rights, on wild animal suffering, on AI suffering. There's still a lot out there that we can do. So I think at this stage, I would just encourage people to get familiar with EA. If you go to 80,000 Hours website, you can download their career guide for free. If you go to GiveWell, you can see the different avenues to use your money to donate to, really positive, impactful causes which align with EA. It's basically just to use all the stuff that's out there, because there is a lot out there, and then to plan what kind of impact you can have using this antinatalist lens in the cause areas that we mentioned.
Yeah, and I will put links to all of those things that John's just mentioned in the description. So, like, literally, if you're interested by or enthused by anything that you've heard in this video, just go to the description and there will be links you can click that will take you to the things we're talking about. So yeah, that'll all be in there. I'll include anything else I think is relevant. John, if if there's something you come up with after we've finished the recording, just send it to me. I'll include that there. Before we finish, I'm going to come to you for anything that you think we've missed that you want to include. But before I come to you, I just want to say, anyone who's watching this video and is sort of, interested by what we've been talking about, or thinks that we're, delusional, and thinks that we're gonna, lead the antinatalist movement down the wrong path. If you have any thoughts at all, like, put them in a comment and leave them below this video, because
Definitely.
one of the intentions of this discussion that me and John are having is to get that conversation going in antinatalist circles, because maybe we are leading antinatalists down a dead end. Maybe we're barking up the wrong tree. So if we are, we want that to be something that's raised. So please
Absolutely.
leave a comment and let us know what you think is the direction that you think antinatalists should be going down. If you think we are barking up the right tree, the correct tree, and you think there's some things that we have maybe missed out but are sort of part of the general framework that we're talking about, if there's any links to a website we haven't mentioned or something like that, mention it in comments below, and I will then, I'll look at all the comments and then I will find that website and put it in the actual description, so there's a link, all of that sort of stuff. So, like, this is a conversation we really want to get other people involved in. So, if you have any thoughts at all, leave them in the comments, because, like, we'll be reading them and it'll be really interesting to see what other people think. John, do you have anything else you want to say that you think you want to elaborate on, or with your things we've missed out before we finish?
No, I think we've basically wrapped everything up. No comments mocking my appearance or my shitty life. No, I'm just kidding. I'd love to hear your feedback, as you were saying, mate. If we are barking up the wrong tree, we really want to know. I've certainly been wrong in the past with my kind of tepid, very vocal, do nothing leftist stuff that I was talking about at uni. I know that you wanted to be a dad at some point, didn't you, Lawrence?
Yeah. But, like, prior to being antinatalist, I mean, maybe it's something I'm still open to with adopted children, but I think it's getting, as I'm, learning more about effective altruism and wanting to do good in the world, it's maybe looking like, even though adopting a child is a really good thing to do, maybe it's not the most effective thing to do. Which, again, maybe that goes back to the whole thing of, you were saying, like, people would see this as a cold sort of way of viewing the world. But yeah, we'll see.
Definitely. And I would encourage people, because some people really do have that parental kind of knack. And there's one thing that I am concerned about, and it follows on from saying that we want to know that if we are wrong, is that I'm still worried with antinatalism, although it does make a lot of sense to me, that I may have found a philosophy that just so happens to be convenient for me. So we were mentioning before about beliefs which are comforting. I'm in a long-term relationship with someone who's never wanted children, and it just so happens we're both vegan, and it just so happens that I found a philosophy that neatly is just perfect for a vegan couple that don't want to have children. That there's something very coincidental about that. So
So basically, you're just worried that antinatalism is a thing you've latched onto, so you don't have to break up with your girlfriend. Is basically what
Basically,
you're
I'm so desperate that I've created this philosophical facade, and it's really just me, not me, just being a massive simp and
saying.
putting my life on hold, my pro-natalist, wonderful life on hold to stay with my current girlfriend. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on, mate. I've really enjoyed this, and thank you for
Yeah.
neatly and succinctly summarising my points when I've rambled on for minutes on end.
It's all good. That's what I'm here for. I'm just making it. I'm just making sure that you use your time in the most effective way possible.
Thank you. Exactly. Very EA of you.
Yeah, that is all I wanted to do. Yeah, no, thank you for coming on. I think like this, hopefully this will be sort of like the start of a conversation that carries on, and people will be able to pile on more ideas, and something tangible will come from it. But we will see what people put in the comments. But yeah, it was a great discussion, and thanks for coming on.
Right. Thanks, mate.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Antinatalist Advocacy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. We would also be really grateful if you could help us get the word out there by sharing this episode far and wide, as well as giving us a positive rating on whichever platform you're listening to us on. To find out more about AA, including careers advice, donation recommendations, and different ways to have a positive impact, you can go to our website at antinatalistadvocacy.org. To keep up to date with what we're up to, feel free to subscribe to our monthly newsletter and follow us on your favourite social media platforms. Links to all of the above are in the description. As always, we are hoping you will join us in our antinatalist advocacy.